All right, today we're cracking open a cold case that's literally 2,000 years old. Our only piece of evidence is a single ancient letter. And our lead detective, a brilliant thinker named William Paley. So, we're going to follow his investigation into the first epistle to Timothy. The big question, are the clues inside going to prove it's the real deal or a very clever fake? So here's our game plan. First, we're going to tackle a huge contradiction that honestly looks like it could blow the whole case apart. Then, we'll see how Paley tries to piece the timeline back together. And finally, we'll zoom in on 3 specific clues, these little fingerprints that just might solve the whole mystery. You know, every great detective story starts with a problem, right? A piece of evidence that just doesn't add up. And this one kicks off with a major contradiction between 2 of our most important historical documents. Okay, so look at this. On the one hand, 1 Timothy says Paul left Timothy behind in Ephesus before he went to Macedonia. Simple enough. But then you look at the book of Acts, our main roadmap for his travels, and it says Timothy was with Paul, accompanying him from Macedonia. Uh-oh, you can't be in 2 places at once. One account says he stayed, the other says he went. That is a huge problem. For any historian, this is a massive red flag. A mistake this big usually points to one thing: forgery. Someone writing much later, trying to sound like Paul, but they just got the details wrong. So, is that what we're looking at here? A clumsy fake? Or could there be a missing piece to this puzzle that we're just not seeing? And this is where William Paley's genius really shines. He looks at this glaring mistake, and he completely flips it on its head. He asks, what if this contradiction isn't a sign of a fake? What if it's actually proof of a journey that's been lost to history? Paley's logic is pretty wild. He says the contradiction is so perfect, it proves this letter cannot fit anywhere in the official timeline from the book of Acts. So, his theory? This letter must have been written after the book of Acts ends. We know Acts closes with Paul in prison in Rome. Paley suggests he was released and went on one last mission, an unrecorded journey that creates the only possible window where this letter makes any sense at all. And Paley isn't just making this up out of thin air. He points to this line from another one of Paul's letters, written while he was in prison. Paul says he fully expects to be released and to travel again. And just like that, this lost journey idea doesn't seem so crazy. It becomes a totally plausible scenario, filling a gap in the record that our letter fits into perfectly. So the timeline could work, but that's not enough to close the case. Now we need to dust for fingerprints inside the letter itself. And our first clue is this really strange, casual phrase, exactly the kind of thing a forger would probably never even think to invent. So, in Chapter 5, the letter is giving instructions on how to care for widows. And it says that a widow shouldn't be taken into the number unless she meets certain requirements. The key phrase is right there, the number. What on earth is that? And this is where it gets really clever. The letter never stops to explain what the number is. It just assumes Timothy already knows. It's a casual insider reference to the church's official support list for widows. Now, think about it. If you were faking this letter, you'd either have to stop and explain the term for your audience, or more likely, you'd never invent such a subtle, specific detail in the first place. It just feels real. All right, our next set of clues is even more subtle. We're looking at pieces of advice that are so weirdly specific and, frankly, kind of boring that you have to ask yourself, why would anyone bother faking this? The letter says a church leader must be no striker, which literally means not a brawler, someone who doesn't get into fistfights. Paley says this is a perfect snapshot of a messy new movement. A forger writing 100 years later, when the church was a much more formal thing, would probably invent some very dignified spiritual requirements. Would they really think to add, oh, and also doesn't punch people? Probably not. And then there's this very personal medical advice, dropped right in the middle of a big discussion about church regulations. It's a specific, domestic note to Timothy, who apparently had a sensitive stomach and was sick a lot. So this really gets to the heart of the matter. Why would a forger trying to write an important religious document invent details about stomach aches and brawling church leaders? Paley's answer is simple. They wouldn't. These aren't the details of a forgery. They're the fingerprints of a real conversation between 2 real people, dealing with real life. Now, our last clue is a bit different. It's not about timelines or random advice. This one is psychological. It's a unique theological idea that feels so personal, so specific, it feels like it could only have come from one person.
So, the author is reflecting on his own past as this violent persecutor of the early church. And he says the whole reason he was shown mercy was so his story could serve as the #1 pattern of grace for every single believer who would come after him.
I mean, that is a really original idea, that Paul's own life is the master pattern for God's mercy. Paley argues this isn't just some generic religious idea that a forger could cook up. He calls it a solemn reflection, an idea that could only be born from the intense, life-changing memory of that experience. It has the ring of truth, not of cold imitation.
So let's just lay all the evidence on the table. We've got the casual, unexplained reference to the number. We have the strangely mundane advice that's just too specific to be fake. And we have this unique theological insight that feels deeply, deeply personal. Now, any one of these clues on its own is subtle, but when you put them all together... And so Paley leaves the final verdict to us. What do you think is more likely? An impossibly clever forger who created a timeline problem just so they could solve it, and then layered in all these tiny, mundane, interlocking clues? Or a genuine letter, whose little imperfections and casual details are actually the authentic fingerprints of history? Paley's whole point is that sometimes the best evidence for something being real isn't that it's perfect, but that it's perfectly and authentically messy.